Okay.
Hello, today I am here with Lauren Mancia, Professor of History in the History Department at Brooklyn College, and she is going to be talking about an article she wrote about the humanities. Actually, not just the humanities, but the early modern humanities. And she is also going to be talking about a fellowship which she has gotten for all of next academic year. So welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. And I'd like, for you to tell us about the exhibition that you mounted at the Brooklyn College Library,
Yes.
and then the article you wrote that came out of it.
Yes, great. So in 2023, Lucas Rubin, who's the director of the Latin Greek Institute at CUNY, and I worked together on an exhibition that celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Latin Greek Institute. And while that was sort of Professor Rubin's remit to think about the Latin Greek Institute, I was thinking more broadly about how 50 years ago, lots and lots of women were on faculty and they were working to promote the study of premodernity. And so among these women are Rita Fleischer, who helped to found the Latin Greek Institute, but also people like Ethel Wolff, for whom the Wolff Institute for the Study of the Humanities is named, who was a classics professor, who was eventually one of the founders of the Brooklyn College acclaimed core curriculum. And they and many other women on faculty really thought that at times of crisis for CUNY, the solution was found in the humanities. And I found that to be incredibly inspiring as a woman, as a pre-modernist, but also as someone who champions the humanities. And so with a group of 9 students, we got some money from the Kurtz Fellowship to help support them in doing research for this exhibition. And then after the exhibition was over, it still lives on the Brooklyn College website. Perhaps we can put in the, comments or whatever, what that URL is for people to see the online version of the exhibition.
Absolutely.
But that exhibition then, after it was done, I really wanted to write about the experience of making the exhibition with the students, and then also of discovering what we came to realize the arguments of the exhibition were. And I thought that that was a really important thing for historians and humanists and people around the academy and around higher education to learn about. Because I think so often we just focus on what's happening in higher education at the Ivy Leagues, focus on what's happening in the sort of institutions that are in the news, but not in what's happening at places like CUNY, which is where the majority of the students of our city go, which is where the majority of students in the United States go. They go to public universities. So I thought that that kind of promotion and advocacy was important. Plus it helps to defend the humanities, which is my favorite pet project.
So I'd like to insert a little bit of Brooklyn College history here,
Please.
as well.
Yes.
In the 1970s, which was a very, very difficult time, excuse me, not only for City University, but all of New York City.
Totally.
Our then President Gerald Ford told New York City to drop dead.
Yeah.
And there was a bigger budget crisis than usual at CUNY. We were not hiring new professors.
Yeah.
And the lifeblood of knowledge comes through the hiring of people who are thinking newly.
Yes.
And being trained newly as well.
Yes.
And so Ethel Wolff, who was then dean of the College of Arts and Sciences,
Yes.
as it was called, came up with the idea of a humanities institute.
Yes, it's so great.
And I happen to have been the person who wrote the grant, the original grant.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
To fund the Humanities Institute. I was on a committee with her.
Yeah.
I should also say, in a slightly less flattering portrait of Ethel Wolf,
Oh, gosh.
that I was attending a meeting of this committee,
Okay.
and I had to take my son to a pediatrician's appointment.
As one does.
And she said
Oh, no.
to everyone, "This is why we shouldn't hire women."
That works against the thesis of the exhibition.
It certainly does. So I'm glad that you got this exhibition.
Yeah,
You want to talk about some of the people you included in the exhibition?
Yeah. So, a lot of what the students initially set out to do was to understand what it was like to be a woman in higher education from 1930 to 1975. And so we did some general research about how hard it was to get a PhD or not. And we found some really amazing things in the Brooklyn College archives. Like in the 1930s, there were lots of women who attended Brooklyn College, but in their last semester before graduation, they had a syllabus concerning matrimony. And the agenda on the syllabus included what to wear on the honeymoon, how to prepare for a baby, etc. There was obviously no syllabus for the male students. And then we saw in contrast that in the 1970s, there were consciousness-raising groups that were sponsored by the newly founded Women's Center. And on the agenda for those groups, we saw why not to get married, why not to have children, and all of these new choices that were available. So we could trace within Brooklyn College history just the history of women in New York City in this time period. Brooklyn College is one of the earliest universities in North America to have a women's studies department. It predates the departments at all the Ivy League schools. And in fact, Brooklyn College also, before any of the Ivy League schools, hired women on its faculty, including some actually really amazing women who were refugees from Germany in the late 1930s. So one of those women's names is Vera Lachmann. And she was a woman who really believed that classics was the way to uplift people in urban New York City. And so not only did she teach classics at Brooklyn College, but she also founded a kind of fresh air fund camp in North Carolina, where she would take her students to North Carolina in the summers, and they would all recite Homer together. So it's a very different time, but it's also amazing that this woman who was a war refugee really thought that she needed to give back to the community by means of this, pre-modern literature. So that was really interesting. We also sort of in the exhibition celebrated the woman who used to be in my position, Elizabeth A.R. Brown, who was one of the earliest women to graduate from Harvard with a PhD in medieval history. She very staunchly believed that she should not be studying women at all because then it would be easy for men to ignore her. And so she studied the most male topic you could think of. She studied French kings and taxation policies. But that became a way for her to actually unravel the way we think about the Middle Ages and to think about how we think about the notion of feudalism. So for centuries and still in sixth grade textbooks, people think about feudalism as an organized system. And Professor Brown dismantled all of that, and she did it from Brooklyn College. So a lot of what we were doing was going into the stacks, even at the library, and taking out these women's books and learning that the copies we have in the library were actually gift copies from them, and a lot of them had inscriptions in them. Another really wonderful example is there were two women in the English department. One was Jacqueline de Wever, who wrote one of the earliest books about Blackness and the Queen of Sheba in medieval literature. And so right now it's very popular to study the ideas of race and the sort of early pre-modern notions of race in literature. But she was doing that in the 90s from her post at Brooklyn College. And so it's really interesting to sort of uncover how these women, despite the sexism against them in the academy and despite their moment, were doing innovative work right here, and often then with their students. So we have pictures in the exhibition of them teaching, them sort of creating classes on slave narratives, which were also classes about sort of pre-modern history, right? Before everyone was reading slave narratives in American history class or in English class, right? These women were really trying to sort of be on the cutting edge of reviving these voices that we often overshadowed in the 30s through the 70s and sometimes still today. And in part, from their own subject position, they knew that they needed to revive voices that are often not listened to in sort of institutions of higher education. And so that's part of what they were doing, which was really amazing to celebrate. We also then in the exhibition uncovered a lot of amazing things about how they thought the humanities were important. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from Vera Lachmann, that refugee that I mentioned before. So Lachmann was a poet, and in addition to writing about classical literature, she also wrote poetry always in German and in English, which is amazing that she would translate out of her native language. And so the stacks have all of her poetry in sort of bilingual editions, which is really exciting. Anyway, so she says in the preface of one of these poetry editions, she says, modernity makes us question traditional enthusiasms. It maligns love as desire for power. It maligns devotion as hypocrisy, beauty as popular appeal. But this is an ultimate denial of values that ends in paralysis. Instead, the building material for the future is understanding. It possibly amazes a disillusioned generation that the frozen isolation, the deadly silence around each self, the dizzying of our absurdity does not preclude its occurrence. That must be called a wonder of wonders. Understanding heals and redeems the hopeless. Understanding saves humans of the future from the course of utter moral confusion. So she's writing that having escaped, right?
What a wonderful thing to say.
It's amazing, right?
Fine.
Exactly. And so she is writing that having escaped World War II, right? She's writing that in the 60s where everyone is like sort of down on the traditions and whatnot. But those are words that are incredibly relevant right now.
Absolutely.
And so to just bring them out of the stacks and into the public eye and then ultimately into the American Historical Review was very satisfying.
Out of the stacks, President Trump just yesterday closed down a library that gives grants to libraries around the country.
Yes, exactly. And so many of these women felt that their education that provided them with understanding and mind-opening possibilities was the thing that they were going to fight for, despite having to walk into separate doors at the faculty club and all these other stories that we uncovered. And so to sort of continue to have their voices be heard in this current moment is incredibly important.
Did you have both men and women and people with other gender identities work on this exhibit?
Yes. And what was really amazing about the students working is that, and I talk about them a little bit in the article, in some cases it was an opportunity for mentorship. So a graduate named Brittany Lugo, who's now an MA student at Fordham, getting her degree in medieval studies, she wanted to work on race in the Middle Ages, and she got to meet Jacqueline DeWeaver. And so that was really neat for her. She got to interview her. She got to write object labels and objects connected to her. So that was a lovely experience. But we also have students who are now alumni who are now working in libraries and archives because of this project. So
Wonderful.
People sort of got the bug touching old smelly paper in the archives. Vera Madley is a student who is presently at NYU. She just won a fellowship to have a funded MA to do library and information science because she's working in archives and wants to continue. And she was also one of our students. So this has allowed for students to sort of find their careers, but also just, have traditional sort of mentoring role experiences. Yeah. The other wonderful thing that a lot of these students got was the feeling of archival discovery. So the article that I wrote really sort of recounts how we put the exhibition together and how students would be looking through archives and then suddenly exclaim in the archive, "I think I found something," and we'd all run over and take a look at what they'd found. And they'd found a teaching evaluation that was filled with judgments about sort of, sexist judgments and things. So, I found these, syllabus for matrimony, all this stuff. So it was a very lovely way also of coming together as a community, which I feel like even in 2023, we still in 2025 need to have this healing experience together.
So did you enter the archives physically together?
Yes.
When you worked?
It was very exciting, yes. So we had certain days where we were in the archives together, and Professor Rubin and I were almost always there, and then the students would come in at whatever free period they could. So.
And can you tell me so that students can know where in the Brooklyn College Library this material exists?
Yes, so the Brooklyn College Library has a special collections room and archive, and in it we have all kinds of objects and papers pertaining to Brooklyn College and its history, but also pertaining to Brooklyn and its history. So oftentimes when you're in there, you're with another scholar who's working on a project connected to the history of boxing, and Brooklyn was major in the history of boxing, or interested in looking at some of the sort of telephone directories and address directories of Brooklyn history. We have a complete archive of those things. So it was also neat for the students to be researchers among researchers in the archive. And the people who run the archive are tremendously knowledgeable, not only about their own archive and archival practices, but also about digital archives around the city. So if that was something, and around the world, so if that were something that a student was interested in, they could just walk onto the first floor of the Brooklyn College Library, just go all the way around the circulation desk, and then keep going in a circle, and they'd hit the special collections room.
And does a student have to get special permission to enter this room?
So the room certainly is open from 10 to 4 every day, and you can sort of ring the doorbell and go on in, and then you'll probably have to make an appointment to look at finding aids and look at, archival materials eventually. Mm-hmm. But you can also drop in to use the research guides that are available to you that are in the reading room itself. And for that, I believe you don't need an appointment, but to deal with any archival material, you should email them first.
Do you have pictures at an exhibition? I'm quoting the title of a piece of music, but is it possible to share with us?
Yes,
images that document this exhibit.
Yes, so the article has some images of students sort of talking to these women at the opening of the exhibition, and also some archival material that we used in the exhibition. Those are in the article. And then the website of the online version of the exhibition, which was actually put together by yet another Brooklyn College student who's an intern at the library. So all of that will be in the Instagram feed.
So we can have it to add.
You can have it all.
That is wonderful.
Bells and whistles.
Terrific. So tell us about the fellowship.
Yes. So I am lucky enough to have been chosen as one of the fellows at the Graduate Center for the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, which is a sort of standing transdisciplinary working group at the Graduate Center. So it has people from anthro, political science, history, art, all kinds of sort of disciplinary walks of life. And there's a core number of faculty members who are always in that working group. And one of them is actually Naomi Schiller from anthropology, our own Naomi Schiller. And then every year they have 5 fellows from around CUNY. And those fellows are invited to talk about a particular theme every year. So the theme I applied to be a part of is frequencies, which in this committee is defined very globally and very loosely. But I made the argument in my application that has a lot to do with what I study, which is monasticism. So that one of the things that I am most interested in when I study medieval monasticism is how monks and nuns felt when they were doing their devotional practice. And monks and nuns notoriously are doing the same devotional practices over and over again. They are repeating the rituals 8 times a day, every day of their life. So the question of frequency and the question of ritual and the question of repetition is the new sort of question that I'm really focusing on in my own work. And my new work is about, as a historian, we tend to privilege the textual archive. And so what I am trying to think about is whether methodologically doing and embodying historical actions give us any additional information about the past that we don't see in the textual archive. So the projects that I have in store for myself are to repeat and re-embody and re-perform a lot of these rituals, not as a Christian devotee, but instead as a historian investigating these rituals. And so I think that this was very exciting for some of the members on the committee, because some of the members on the committee are people like Joan Scott, who's an emerita professor in history and has recently written a kind of manifesto attacking history for still believing that we can have an objective view of the past and for still holding on to text as truth about that objective view. And so in some ways, my project is trying to also undermine that sort of misapprehension among the majority of historians that are out there. And I think it plays a little bit into the work of someone like Joan Scott, but also into the work of someone like Claire Bishop, who is an art historian on the committee and works on performance art, where you also in contemporary performance art see repetitive activity, durational performance. And when we think about these in terms of secular performance, like a man dragging a big cube of ice through the street, right? We don't think about it in terms of pre-modern medieval monasticism, but it's very, very similar. And so what happens when we put pre-modern religion in conversation with people who are working on hyper-modern secular stuff? And what happens when we put pre-modern monasticism in a committee that's interested in social change? Like, that is very exciting to me. So I feel very honored that they are allowing me to take part in these sort of working group sessions, in part because I think that in 2025, we need more than ever to think about premodernity as like a possible sort of set of answers or a set of examples for how it is that we should conduct ourselves in the future.
So I find it interesting that when you said the word frequency originally, that I had a completely different association
Music
with the word. I was thinking about frequency, electronic frequency, or the vibrational meaning of frequency, which relates to, I think, emotion.
Definitely.
So I'm interested in the physiological definition of frequency.
Yes.
And how that will inflect your understanding of your devotional, in a secular sense, practice, because it is going to be a work of devotion to do this.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that the other thing that's so interesting is that, the model, the blueprint for our contemporary university was the medieval monastery. Mm-hmm. So lots of universities in North America look like medieval buildings. They have Gothic or neo-Gothic architecture. The central quadrangle in the university, our East Quad, our West Quad, these are spaces that are based off of medieval cloisters, which are in the middle of every medieval monastery. And so what happens when we think about devotion to understanding as very similar to the monastic devotion to God, right? Certainly, I think that my suffering while writing might be a little bit akin to their suffering while praying. So I think that's not too far off to think about sort of the emotion as physiologically similar in the two different time periods, and maybe also in the particular context that I am in, that my students are in, that anyone who's trying to learn is in.
So another, we should acknowledge that we just attended a Wolf Institute celebration today. It's called Hess Week.
Yes.
In honor of the, I think, 6th president of Brooklyn College, Robert Hess. Good history. Who was president in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And we attended a panel today on history and the courts, meaning the Supreme Court. Yeah. And one of the panelists talked about the kind of memory, which is physiologic memory, the deep memory of trauma, that is not recoverable simply by citing court cases. For example, one of the panelists mentioned that until she went to law school, she had never heard about the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre of the Black population of what was called Black Wall Street, an area in Tulsa. And I was thinking about the trauma of that experience, which is not merely recoverable through acknowledgement that it happened. And I'm wondering, in your case, about the recovery of that deep sense of what it meant to be a nun or a priest or a monk during the period that you were studying, by sensorily repeating the experience. You want to talk about that?
Definitely. I mean, I think there are a couple of things, right? The first thing is that traditionally, especially in history programs, but I think all over the academy, traditionally we have diminished the importance or the use of our bodies in scholarly exploration, right? We're, disembodied heads, we're brains. That allows us to feel somehow more objective, to think that way, right? But if someone is, studying sports, right, the use of the body by athletes, right, you have to be very careful to sort of hide that you were once an athlete. There's somehow that historically has been a disconnect. But I think that is changing. And I think that one of the places it is changing the most is actually in Black studies. So the woman that we heard speak today was mentioning Toni Morrison's ideas of rememory and beloved. But some texts that my students are really just loving right now are the text by Christina Sharp called In the Wake, which is also about the sort of physiological epigenetic memory of slavery. So she's thinking about the wake of a slave ship, and she's thinking also about the wake of history and how long after the boat is gone, beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's so beautiful. Long after the boat is gone, you still see the wake in the waves, right? And so,
which is resonance.
Yes, exactly. It's
frequency.
True. And probably if we got a mathematician in here, they could explain how it was also frequency to me. But I think that, people like Christina Sharp and Sadia Hartman are really making waves with students because they are integrating the body, because they are thinking about, okay, so the archive, which is preserved by the victors of history, right, doesn't necessarily have the experiences, particularly of formerly enslaved women in it, right? So do we just let that archival silence stand and say we don't have anything, we don't know? Or do we do something different? And how can we explore sort of the experiences of sort of bodies of women who are descendants of these enslaved people, for instance? And so, I'm not trying to say that to study monasticism is the same thing as to study slavery, right? But the pre-modern archive is also fragmentary, and our contemporary ideas about Christianity, its history, the history of the institution of the church, what horrible things in history the church has been responsible for, etc., right? All of those things often get in the way of our being able to see monks and nuns on their own terms, on their own medieval terms. So what happens if we activate the body in trying to do that exploration? Is there a rigorous methodology that we all can use that is not just Renaissance fair kind of creative anachronism, but is rather, something that allows us to really empathize on an embodied level with the people in the past? And, I think many historians would say that empathy is sort of the greatest use of history, the first stage towards reading history, reading texts, reading images, and reading actions.